Officer Ethan Grayson had spent years abusing his power, using his badge as a weapon rather than a shield. He had a reputation in the department: tough, no nonsense, and, most importantly, untouchable. Complaints of excessive force, racial profiling, and intimidation piled up, but nothing ever came of them. He had connections, and in his world, that meant power. For Grayson, Denver County wasn't a place of justice. It was his personal kingdom, where he made the rules and decided who deserved respect. Time and time again, his actions were swept under the rug. When citizens of color cried foul, his system backed him up. He had no reason to believe today would be any different. It was another routine day at the Denver County Courthouse. Grayson stood tall, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. He had testified in countless cases before, always with the same smug certainty. In his mind, justice was whatever he said it was. As the judge prepared to issue a ruling, Grayson's eyes swept the gallery. That's when he noticed her, a black woman, sitting quietly in the back. She wasn't dressed like the usual defendants or family members he was used to seeing. Her sleek black suit, her upright posture, the calm intensity in her gaze, it was unsettling. He dismissed the thought. Probably some public defender, or worse, another grieving relative hoping for a miracle. He had seen that look before, and it always ended the same way: disappointment. Then, she stood up. Grayson stiffened. He didn't like this. There was something about her, something that set off alarms in his mind. She wasn't afraid, wasn't intimidated. That wasn't how things worked in his world. He reacted the way he always did, with force. "Sit down, lady," he barked, his voice sharp, commanding. "This isn't your business." She didn't move. Grayson's jaw clenched. He took a step forward, gripping her arm roughly. She still didn't flinch. "I said, sit down," he growled, pushing her back slightly. He expected resistance. He expected submission. Instead, she reached into her jacket. Grayson's instincts flared, his muscles tensed, his hand twitched toward his holster. He had drawn his gun for less. But then, she pulled out a badge. The room fell silent. The air turned ice cold. She met his gaze, unwavering, and spoke. "Officer Grayson, I am Chief Vanessa Lawson, and as of this morning, I am your new boss." For the first time in Ethan Grayson's career, the air around him felt different. He was no longer in control. The courtroom, once filled with quiet murmurs and the shuffle of papers, had fallen into absolute silence. The weight of Chief Vanessa Lawson's words still hung in the air, suffocating and undeniable. He stared at her badge, its golden sheen under the courtroom lights burning into his retinas like a cruel joke. His new boss? No. Impossible. Grayson's smug confidence cracked, his usual arrogance faltering under the watchful gazes of the judge, the attorneys, and the onlookers in the gallery. The silence was worse than any reprimand. It was recognition. They were watching him crumble. "This isn't how it was supposed to go." "Your Honor," Lawson's voice cut through the tension like a razor. She didn't raise her voice, didn't waver, but there was no mistaking the authority in her words. "Before we proceed, I'm requesting an immediate review of Officer Grayson's past misconduct cases." The words sent a chill down Grayson's spine. His past wasn't clean, far from it. Across the bench, Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses. His gaze flickered between Lawson and Grayson, taking in the scene with measured thought. Grayson had always assumed the judge was in his corner, or at the very least, indifferent. But today, there was a shift, a hesitation. "Chief Lawson," the judge said, carefully choosing his words, "that is a serious request. Do you have cause for such an investigation?" Lawson didn't blink. "Yes, Your Honor. And I have the records to prove it." Grayson's stomach twisted. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not like this. The judge exhaled sharply. "Very well." He lifted his gavel and banged it down, sealing Grayson's fate. "Court is in recess for 15 minutes. A sharp buzz of conversation erupted as the room processed what had just happened. Attorneys whispered to their clients. Court officials exchanged wary glances. Grayson stood frozen, heart hammering against his ribcage. As the courtroom emptied, Grayson felt his power slipping through his fingers, inch by inch. For the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. Before she was Chief Vanessa Lawson, before the badge, before the authority, she was just a 15-year-old girl in Birmingham, Alabama, watching her world shatter. It happened on a humid summer evening. She and her older brother, Marcus, had gone to the corner store to grab ice cream, something so simple, so normal. But normal never lasted long in their neighborhood. The flashing red and blue lights came out of nowhere. "Put your hands where I can see them." A police car screeched to a stop, and two officers stormed out. Marcus barely had time to turn before they were on him. No explanation. No questions. Just force. Vanessa's ice cream hit the pavement, melting into the cracks of the sidewalk as she watched her brother get slammed against the hood of the cruiser. "Please. What did he do?" she screamed, trying to get closer. One officer turned to her, his voice sharp and dismissive. "He matches the description." That was all they needed. Matches the description. 3 words that gave them permission to treat Marcus like he was nothing. They handcuffed him, shoved him into the back seat, and drove away. He hadn't done anything. He never even resisted. That night changed everything. Vanessa sat with her mother, waiting by the phone, waiting for news that never came. Marcus was gone for hours, locked up with no charges, no explanations, just suspicion. When he finally came home, his face was swollen, his lips split. He never talked about what happened inside that jail cell. He didn't have to. From that moment on, Vanessa knew what she had to do. She enlisted in the police academy, fueled by anger, by purpose, by something bigger than herself. But it wasn't easy. Racism in the academy. Doubts from superiors. Corrupt officers trying to push her out. Every step up the ranks, she was told she wasn't meant to be there. But she refused to quit. Years passed. She climbed. She fought. She proved herself. Now, at 48 years old, she wasn't just a cop, she was the first black female police chief in Denver. And her first order of business? Cleaning house, starting with Officer Ethan Grayson. Ethan Grayson had spent his entire career believing he was untouchable. Even now, as his world began to crumble around him, he refused to accept defeat. The moment court recessed, he stormed out of the building, his hands clenched into tight fists. He needed to fix this fast. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a number he never thought he'd have to use. "Yeah, it's me," he muttered, keeping his voice low as he hurried to his car. His pulse pounded in his ears. "We have a problem." The person on the other end didn't need details. They already knew. Grayson had connections, people who had protected him for years, covering up his messes, making sure his record stayed clean, ensuring that internal investigations never went anywhere. He had never planned for this moment, but he had always known who to call if things ever went south. That night, while the city slept, the real battle began. Inside the Denver Police Department, a figure in dark clothing slipped past security, moving with precision and purpose. No alarms. No cameras catching their face. Files vanished. Reports, complaints, evidence of excessive force all gone. Computers were wiped. Case files were deleted. By morning, it was as if the allegations had never existed. But Grayson didn't stop there. He wanted to send a message. When Chief Vanessa Lawson arrived at her office the next morning, she immediately felt that something was off. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, her desk was ransacked. Papers littered the floor. Her filing cabinets were pried open, emptied. And in the center of her desk, a single piece of paper sat neatly placed. "Back off." A threat. A warning. But instead of intimidation, a slow, knowing smile spread across her face. They had just confirmed what she already knew: Grayson was hiding something. And now, she had every reason to dig deeper. She grabbed her phone, her voice steady and unwavering. "Give me a search warrant. I know exactly where to look." Chief Vanessa Lawson had seen enough corruption in her career to know one thing: dirty cops always have a backup plan. The files that had disappeared from the police department weren't destroyed. No, men like Ethan Grayson didn't just erase evidence, they hid it. And she was about to find it. With a search warrant in hand, Lawson and her team drove 30 minutes outside Denver, stopping at a rundown self-storage facility on the outskirts of the city. The building was falling apart: rusted doors, cracked pavement, and flickering overhead lights. The kind of place people forgot existed. Until now. Her officers cut through the lock on Unit 317, Grayson's off-duty storage space. The metal door groaned open, revealing box after box of hidden files, old VHS tapes, and USB drives stacked neatly in plastic bins. "He kept everything," one officer muttered in disbelief. Lawson stepped inside, her sharp gaze scanning the labels. Victims' names, dates, case numbers. Some of these people were still fighting for justice. Others were long-forgotten, buried cases, deemed justified long ago. But one name stopped her cold. Jason Cole, 2013. A name she hadn't heard in years. Jason had been 17 years old when he was shot and killed by Officer Grayson. Back then, Grayson had claimed Jason reached for a gun during a traffic stop. There had been no body cam footage to prove otherwise. Until now. Lawson picked up the USB drive labeled Cole, 2013, and plugged it into her laptop. The screen flickered to life. Grainy body cam footage appeared. At first, it looked routine: Grayson pulling Jason over, approaching the driver's side. Then, the gunshot. Jason collapsed, unarmed, defenseless. But then came the most damning moment. Grayson stepped back, reached into his own belt, and dropped a handgun next to Jason's body. Then he called it in. Calm. Collected. As if it was just another day. The entire room went silent. Lawson's hands clenched into fists. This was it. The undeniable proof. Grayson hadn't just abused his power, he was a murderer. And now, she had everything she needed to bring him down. Chief Vanessa Lawson stood at the steps of the Denver Police Department, the morning sun casting long shadows behind her. The weight of what she was about to do pressed against her shoulders, but she didn't flinch. Before her, dozens of cameras pointed in her direction, reporters packed together, microphones stretched forward. The air buzzed with tension. Behind her, a large screen displayed the body cam footage, the undeniable proof of Officer Ethan Grayson's crimes. Lawson took a breath, then spoke. This morning, my office uncovered new evidence regarding Officer Ethan Grayson's involvement in multiple cases of excessive force, obstruction of justice, and most damning of all, the 2013 killing of Jason Cole. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously. The footage you are about to see, Lawson continued, her voice unwavering, proves that Officer Grayson planted a weapon on an unarmed teenager after fatally shooting him. She nodded to an officer standing near the screen. With a click, the video played. The grainy footage filled the screen, showing the cold, calculated actions of Grayson as he casually dropped the weapon next to Jason's lifeless body. Then came his voice, captured on the recording. Suspect reached for a gun. Had no choice. The lie played out in real time. The crowd erupted in gasps. Some reporters covered their mouths. Others immediately reached for their phones to break the story. The headlines flooded every news channel within minutes. Officer Ethan Grayson caught in murder cover-up. Body cam footage reveals shocking corruption in Denver PD. Justice for Jason Cole. The truth finally comes out. Across town, Grayson watched it all unfold. He stood in a dimly lit bar, his whiskey glass shaking in his hand, eyes locked on the television. His name, his face, his crimes. Every news ticker dragged him into the light. His phone buzzed. He grabbed it, hoping for an ally, a lifeline, someone who could still pull him out of this mess. Instead, his lawyer's voice came through the line, cold and detached. Grayson, the man sighed. You're being suspended indefinitely. The evidence is indisputable. Grayson's stomach twisted. His grip tightened around the glass. This is a damn hit job, he hissed. They set me up? No, Ethan, his lawyer cut him off. You did this to yourself. And then, the line went dead. For the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson was powerless. Ethan Grayson was gone. By the time police arrived at his house, the place was empty, his car missing, his phone left behind on the kitchen counter. He had vanished without a trace. The Denver Police Department wasted no time. Within hours, a statewide manhunt was in full effect. Every airport, every highway, every bus station being watched. His face was plastered across news stations, social media, and wanted bulletins. Fugitive officer on the run after murder cover-up exposed. His former colleagues, the same ones who once laughed at his jokes and had his back, now spoke about him in the past tense. He's dangerous, one officer told reporters. If you see him, don't approach. Call 911. But Chief Vanessa Lawson knew better. Grayson wasn't going to run forever. Men like him, narcissists, power-hungry cowards, they didn't just disappear. They needed control. He wouldn't flee the country. He would fight. And she knew exactly how to draw him out. With police combing the streets, Lawson made a calculated move. A tip was leaked to the media. An informant was willing to testify. Someone who had worked closely with Grayson. Someone who had the final piece of evidence to seal his fate. It was a lie. A trap. And Lawson knew Grayson would take the bait. A meeting was arranged at an abandoned steel factory on the outskirts of Denver. a place where no one could hear gunshots, no one could call for help. Grayson would think he was coming to silence a witness. Instead, he was walking straight into the lion's den. That night, Lawson waited in the shadows, her badge hidden, her weapon loaded. The air was thick with silence. The distant hum of a freight train echoed in the distance. And then the sound of approaching footsteps. Grayson was here, just as she expected. The abandoned steel factory was deathly quiet, the cold night air settling over rusted beams and shattered glass. The only sound was the faint drip of water leaking from a cracked pipe. Somewhere in the darkness, Ethan Grayson waited. His breathing was shallow, his finger tight against the trigger of his stolen Glock. His body was tense, pressed against a stack of rusted metal crates, waiting for the right moment. He wasn't going to prison, not without a fight. Then footsteps. Steady, unhurried. She was here. Chief Vanessa Lawson stepped into the dimly lit space, her posture calm, controlled, fearless. "It's over, Grayson," she said, her voice steady as steel. No hesitation, no fear, just a truth he couldn't escape. Grayson's jaw clenched. Like hell it was. He saw his life crumbling, his power gone, his name dragged through the mud. He had lost everything, and the woman standing before him was the reason why. Hatred boiled inside him. He would not let her win. With a sudden burst of movement, he lunged from the shadows, gun raised. Bang! A single gunshot ripped through the factory, echoing off steel walls. Grayson staggered back, his grip loosening, his weapon clattering to the ground. A crimson stain spread across his shoulder. His breath came in ragged gasps as his legs buckled, and he collapsed against a metal beam, his world spinning out of control. The sound of sirens roared through the night. Red and blue lights flashed through the broken windows. Within seconds, officers stormed the factory, their weapons trained on him. Hands where we can see them. Grayson had no fight left. He gritted his teeth, eyes blazing with fury as officers yanked him forward, forcing his hands behind his back. The cold bite of metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. For the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson wasn't the one giving orders. He was the one being dragged away in chains. And Chief Vanessa Lawson stood over him, watching justice finally catch up. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, and the air buzzed with anticipation. This was the day justice would be served. Ethan Grayson sat at the defense table, his once pristine suit now wrinkled, his hands clasped together in forced composure. He still carried the same arrogance in his posture, but his eyes told a different story, a man who knew the walls had closed in around him. Chief Vanessa Lawson sat in the front row, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had fought for this moment, for the victims who never got their day in court. And today, the system was finally listening. The jury foreman stood, clearing his throat as the courtroom fell into silence. On the charge of second-degree murder, guilty. A murmur rippled through the room. On the charge of evidence tampering, guilty. Grayson's jaw tightened. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. The judge nodded grimly, then turned his attention to Grayson. "Mr. Grayson," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality, "this court finds you responsible for a pattern of corruption, abuse of power, and the deliberate obstruction of justice. You have not only failed the badge, but have actively participated in the destruction of public trust. For these crimes, you are sentenced to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." A sharp gasp spread across the courtroom. Vanessa exhaled slowly. Not out of relief because there was still more work to be done, but because for the first time, accountability had won. Grayson remained stone-faced, but his hands twitched against the table. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He had spent his career thinking he was above the law, and now he was nothing more than another convicted felon. As the bailiff approached, Grayson's hands were cuffed one final time. For the first time, he felt what so many of his victims had felt: powerless. The aftermath, a department in chaos. Grayson's conviction shook the Denver Police Department to its core. His downfall triggered a full-scale corruption investigation. Internal Affairs uncovered a network of officers who had helped cover his tracks, falsify reports, and silence complaints. Some officers resigned before they could be fired. Others were placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. The thin blue line had cracked. For the first time in years, the people of Denver saw real change. It wouldn't fix everything overnight, but it was a start. Chief Vanessa Lawson walked out of the courthouse, past the swarm of reporters shouting her name. One final question stopped her in her tracks. "Chief Lawson, What does this verdict mean for the future of law enforcement? She looked straight into the camera, her voice steady. It means the system finally did its job. And it's just the beginning. Then, she turned and walked away. The fight wasn't over. But today, justice had finally won. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, cameras, and flashing lights. The verdict had just been announced, but the real story was unfolding outside. Chief Vanessa Lawson emerged from the heavy courthouse doors, stepping into the crisp afternoon air. The tension in the crowd was palpable, every journalist eager to capture her reaction. Microphones were shoved forward. Voices overlapped. Chief Lawson, do you consider this a victory? What does Grayson's conviction mean for the future of the department? Then came the question that made her pause. How does it feel to bring down Officer Grayson? For a moment, she said nothing. The cameras zoomed in, waiting for an emotional response, something dramatic, something headline-worthy. But when Vanessa finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, and firm. This was never about bringing down one man. The reporters stilled. The noise died down. Vanessa held her gaze steady, looking straight into the cameras. It was about holding a system accountable. A ripple of silence spread through the crowd. Some reporters exchanged glances, understanding the gravity of her words. Others scribbled frantically, knowing they had just captured the defining quote of the day. Vanessa didn't wait for follow-ups. She had said what needed to be said. She turned, descending the courthouse steps, walking past reporters, past onlookers, past the people who had fought for justice alongside her. She had won today, but she wasn't naive. This was just one battle in a much larger war. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A new message. Unknown number. One down. Many more to go. Vanessa's grip tightened around the phone. She knew exactly what that meant. This wasn't over. Grayson had fallen, but he wasn't the only corrupt officer who had thrived under the same broken system. She exhaled, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Then, with quiet determination, she opened her car door, stepped inside, and drove off into the city she had sworn to fix. The fight wasn't over, but change had begun.